He thought he had buried his enemies. He thought the blood debt ended 8 years ago. He was wrong, because the crying girl in his restaurant was not random. She was the daughter of the bodyguard who died saving him, and she had just become the centerpiece of a brutal revenge plan. What started as a quiet visit to his own restaurant was about to end in betrayal, gunfire, and a choice that would change both of their lives forever.
Heels. Gabriel Mercer came back to Obsidian after midnight with dried blood on the cuff of his shirt and the taste of copper still sitting at the back of his tongue. Not his blood. Not tonight. In his world, that distinction mattered less and less every year. Heels. But he still noticed it. He still felt the difference between the nights when violence sat outside him and the nights when it entered his bones and stayed there. Heels. Obsidian glowed on the corner of Spring and Ninth like nothing ugly had ever happened within a mile of it. Floor-to-ceiling glass, warm amber lighting, jazz low enough to suggest class, loud enough to cover private conversations. Heels. The kind of place where actors came with agents, hedge fund men came with women half their age, and politicians came through side doors pretending not to know one another. Gabriel had built it that way on purpose. Heels. Every legitimate business he owned had two functions. It made money, and it told him the truth. Heels. A place only belonged to him if he knew what happened in it when he was not announced. That was why he sometimes came alone. No convoy, no bodyguards in sight, no reservation, no warning call. Heels. A man learned more from the face an employee wore when they thought no one important was looking than from 1,000 polished reports on a desk. He stepped inside and the hostess smiled automatically. Heels. The way people do when they have been trained to smile before they think. Gabriel gave a small nod and took a seat near the bar without using his name. 36 years old, owner of a hospitality group on paper, head of something far darker in reality. Heels. A man the city feared without quite proving why. Tonight he wanted one quiet drink, 10 minutes to observe the room, and then he would go upstairs to the penthouse and wash away another evening that had taken more from him than it gave. Heels. That was the plan until he heard a sound that did not belong there. A muffled sob, small, choked down. Heels. The kind that comes from someone who has learned crying in public is dangerous. He looked toward the hallway leading to the staff area and saw a young woman standing just inside the break room. Obsidian uniform, hair tied back, heels. Both hands gripping the edge of a table, as if that cheap piece of laminate was all that was keeping her upright. Another employee, a young man, was whispering to her urgently, but her body told the story before her face did. Heels. Fear had made a home inside her, not the ordinary fear of being poor or tired or one paycheck away from panic. Something more specific. Fear of a person. Fear of what happens after the shift ends. Gabriel rose without realizing he had done it. Heels. Then she lifted her head. Green eyes. Clear green with little gold flecks around the pupil. For a moment, the room around him dropped away. 8 years disappeared. Heels. He was 28 again, trapped in an armored sedan that was no longer armored enough, hearing glass explode under automatic fire, feeling his father's weight collapse beside him, feeling another man throw his own body across Gabriel's chest. Heels. Thomas Sullivan, loyal bodyguard, silent protector, green eyes turning dim in the dark while blood filled the seams of Gabriel's shirt. My daughter, Grace, please. Thomas had not managed more than that. Heels. He had died with the request unfinished, and Gabriel had lived with that unfinished sentence somewhere behind his ribs ever since, though he had buried it under wars, territory, strategy, revenge, and the daily mechanics of remaining alive. Heels. Now those eyes were here, in his restaurant, in a crying waitress gripping a table because she was trying not to break. Heels. Gabriel sat back down slowly and ordered water, because whiskey would move too quickly through his system, and he wanted his mind clear. Heels. Across the floor stood Derek Lawson, the restaurant manager, 40-something, tall, neat suit. Hands folded in front of him, the posture of professionalism, the gaze of a hunter. Gabriel had known men like that his whole life. Heels. The most dangerous predators were rarely the loud ones. They hid inside institutions. They wore pressed shirts. They learned policy language and weaponized it. They understood how to break people without leaving marks anyone else could explain. Heels. Derek watched the staff like their pain belonged to him. When the crying woman reappeared a few minutes later, with red eyes and a tray balanced in trembling hands, Derek glanced at her in passing. A small look. Less than a second. Heels. That was all Gabriel needed. Possession. Control, satisfaction, not management, not concern, ownership. Gabriel's hand tightened around the glass. At the far end of the bar stood Jake Morrison, officially a bartender. Heels, unofficially Gabriel's eyes inside Obsidian for the last 2 years. Heels. Jake approached with the smooth, unbothered rhythm of a man who knew how to speak under surveillance. "What can I get you, sir?" he asked. "Whiskey neat," Gabriel said, then waited until Jake set the glass down. "The manager," he added softly. Heels. Jake kept polishing. "Problem. How bad? Bad enough I started notes. Secret calls after shift. Alley behind the kitchen. Same routine, same caution. Men come through the back every couple of weeks. Not customers. Don't move like customers." Heels. Gabriel took one slow sip. "And the girl?" Jake's cloth slowed for half a beat. "He asks about her. Family, especially her father." Gabriel said nothing. He did not need to. His silence meant continue. Jake leaned in slightly. Heels, still playing bartender. "Staff say her name is Grace. Hard worker. Never late, never says no. Has debt, big debt. Manager uses it." Rage in Gabriel never came as hit first. It came as stillness, a terrible stillness. "Who told you?" "Ryan Torres. Server." Heels. "Friends with her. Scared." Gabriel's gaze traveled to Ryan, who was now carrying 2 plates toward a corner booth and pretending not to look in this direction. Gabriel waited another minute. Heels. Then moved to the service station where Ryan was stacking napkins with unnecessary focus. "Pen," Gabriel said, as though he needed one. Ryan handed it over. Gabriel did not leave. "Your friend isn't fine," Ryan swallowed. "She's fine." "No." Heels. Gabriel said quietly. "She isn't." Silence did what threats often could not. It pressed. It asked without asking. Ryan's shoulders sagged. "Her name's Grace Sullivan," he whispered. The surname hit Gabriel like a fist to the sternum. Heels. But he did not show it. "Her mom died of cancer a few years ago. Bills wrecked her. $127,000 in hospital debt. She dropped out of school. Works all the time. Derek knows she can't afford to lose the job." Heels. "So he gives her the worst shifts, makes her do unpaid overtime. Says if she complains he'll blackball her." Heels. "Says girls like her are replaceable." Gabriel kept his face calm. Anything else? Ryan looked past him and all the color drained from his face. "I have to work." He slipped away. Gabriel did not need to turn to know Derek was standing behind him. Heels. He could feel that cold, measuring attention on the back of his neck. When he finally looked, Derek was smiling, the kind of expensive restaurants taught men to weaponize. "Good evening, sir. I'm Derek Lawson, manager of Obsidian." Heels. "I wanted to make sure everything is to your satisfaction." Gabriel gave him an easy nod. "It is." Derek's eyes did not blink enough. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so." "You look familiar." "Common face." Derek smiled again. Heels. But this time the smile had strain inside it. "Well, enjoy your evening." He walked off, but not before signaling one of the servers with a subtle tilt of his head toward Gabriel. "Watch him." Gabriel almost admired the instinct. Almost. Heels. Outside in the parking lot, he called Marcus Webb. Marcus answered before the first ring completed. He always did. "Boss, I need everything on Grace Sullivan. Family, address, employment history, debt, schooling, everything now." Heels. Marcus did not ask why. That was one reason he was still alive after 12 years at Gabriel's side. How fast? Faster than that. Gabriel ended the call and looked back through the glass. Heels. Grace stood at the register with her head lowered while Derek spoke to her too closely. She nodded without lifting her eyes. Not agreement. Submission. The kind learned in people who have been forced to pick survival over dignity too many times. Heels. Gabriel hated that look. He hated it because he knew exactly how people like Derek were made. And he hated it because in another life, if different men had shaped him differently, he might have grown into some polished version of the same cruelty. Heels. Power without conscience always wanted witnesses weaker than itself. Heels. That was true in the underworld. It was true in offices, marriages, police departments, kitchens, boardrooms, churches, and restaurants. The clothing changed. The appetite did not. Heels. Gabriel waited in his Bentley until Marcus called back 23 minutes later. "Say it," Gabriel said. Marcus exhaled once. "Her full name is Grace Ellen Sullivan. 27, daughter of Thomas Sullivan." Gabriel shut his eyes. Heels. It still hit even though he knew it was coming. Continue. Mother was Linda Sullivan. Worked as a school administrative assistant, then private elder care. Died 6 years ago after a 10-month cancer battle. Heels. Bills totaled $127,000 and change. Insurance covered almost nothing. Grace left college in her 3rd year. Since then, she's worked retail, cleaning, grocery, waitressing. Started at Obsidian 14 months ago. Heels. Gabriel looked down at his own hand on the steering wheel. Feels. Thomas had died asking for his daughter, and for 8 years she had been drowning a few miles from buildings Gabriel owned. City blocks Gabriel controlled. Doctors Gabriel could have paid in a single afternoon, and he had not known. Feels. He had been busy avenging the dead while failing the living. Marcus kept talking. There's more. Derek Lawson isn't just a manager. He has ties to Victor Crane. Gabriel's voice turned to ice. Victor Crane died. No, Marcus said. Or not enough, Feels. I don't know how he got out, but he did. He's been rebuilding in pieces quietly. Derek is one of his men. Gabriel's jaw set so hard it hurt. Victor Crane, the architect of the ambush that killed Gabriel's father and Thomas Sullivan, Feels. The ghost Gabriel believed he had buried under 8 years of retaliation. And Grace? Marcus was silent just long enough to make Gabriel want to tear the phone in half. Victor knows who she is. That job at Obsidian was arranged. Feels. Derek was placed there to watch her. Feels. Maybe control her. Maybe prep her. I don't have the full endgame yet, but this is deliberate. Gabriel went still, every piece locked together at once. Grace had not wandered into danger. She had been guided into it. Not because of anything she had done, Feels. Because men like Victor never really moved on from old hatred. They carried grievance like a religion. They wanted payment from children for the sins they assigned to the dead. Handle Derek tonight, Gabriel said. No mess. No noise, Feels. And start pulling on Victor from every side. Understood. Gabriel got out of the Bentley and walked back into Obsidian. He no longer cared about staying invisible. In the staff hallway, he heard Derek before he saw him. After close, Feels, the manager said in a low voice sharpened by habit, "You'll do what I told you." Grace's answer came small and frayed. "I can't. You can. Or you can lose this job and explain that debt to the next landlord." Feels. Girls with no references don't get many choices. Feels. Gabriel stepped back into shadow and let Derek pass. It took effort not to break the man's wrist then and there. When the hallway emptied, Gabriel moved toward Grace. Feels. She had wrapped her arms around herself and leaned against the wall like a person trying to occupy as little space as possible. It struck him then how often decent people are forced to shrink so cruel people can feel large. "Grace," he said. She flinched, Feels, then straightened immediately, pulling on a polite mask that did not fit anymore. "Sir, this area is for staff." "I know." He took one step closer. "I need to talk to you." "About your father." Her face changed in an instant. "You knew my father?" "Yes." Feels. "My father was a truck driver. He died in a traffic accident." "No," Gabriel said gently. "That is what your mother told you. It is not what happened." She stared at him. Feels. He told her enough of the truth to open the door, and no more than she could bear standing up. Thomas Sullivan had been a bodyguard. Feels. He had protected Gabriel's family for years. 8 years earlier, there had been an ambush. Thomas had died shielding Gabriel with his own body. Grace's tears came without noise. "Your father died a brave man," Gabriel said. Feels. "And the last thing he tried to do was speak your name." Grace covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. He saw grief, anger, confusion, and something else that felt almost worse. Relief. Relief that her father had not died in some dull, meaningless accident. Feels. Human beings can endure almost any pain more easily than meaninglessness. Give suffering a shape, a cause, a dignity, and the broken heart finds something to hold. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she whispered. Feels. "Your mother was probably trying to keep the violence away from you. She should have trusted me with the truth." "Maybe," Gabriel said. "Maybe she was too scared to know what the truth would do to a child." Feels. Grace looked at him with those impossible green eyes, and he felt the old wound inside him open cleanly. "I failed your father," he said. "I should have found you." Before she could answer, Derek returned, saw them together, Feels, and started in with practiced authority. Gabriel cut him off by taking a card from his inside pocket and holding it up between two fingers. "Gabriel Mercer," he said, "owner of Obsidian." Derek's confidence drained so fast it was almost obscene. "Mr. Feels. Mercer, I didn't know." "No," Gabriel said, "you didn't." He turned to Grace. "You are done taking orders from him." Then to Derek, voice dropping so low it became more frightening than a shout. "Office now." Feels. Inside the office, Derek tried the usual lies first. Misunderstanding, management style, personnel issue. Gabriel let him talk exactly long enough to feel false hope. Then he said Victor Crane's name. Derek folded. Feels. The human mind likes to imagine evil men as fearless. Most are not. Feels. Most are only bold when they think the scales are loaded in their favor. Derek gave up the warehouse location, the surveillance notes, the fact that Victor had been studying Gabriel's habits for years, and the ugliest detail of all, Feels. Victor wanted Gabriel to watch Thomas Sullivan's daughter suffer before he died. Gabriel called human resources and terminated Derek through official channels because appearances mattered, feels. Then he called Marcus and sentenced Derek through unofficial ones because reality mattered more. When he stepped out of the office, Grace was waiting where he had told her to wait, though she looked as if one hard breath might knock her over, feels. "You're coming with me," Gabriel said, "just for tonight, until I know who is moving and from where." "I don't know you," she said, but there was exhaustion under the resistance, not defiance. "You know enough," he replied, feels. And right now that has to do. She should have said no. In a more ordinary story, she would have. Feels. But ordinary stories did not leave women alone with debt, grief, predatory bosses, and the sudden revelation that the father they mourned had been killed in a hidden war. Feels. Reality sometimes pushes people into trusting the only hand that appears steady in a burning room. Grace looked down the hallway where Derek had disappeared, then back at Gabriel. "One night," she said, "until I understand what's happening." Feels. Gabriel nodded. "One night." He led her out through the service elevator, past the city that kept eating good people whole, and for the first time in 8 years he felt Thomas Sullivan's unfinished last words begin to move toward an answer. Feels. Grace did not speak during the drive to the penthouse, and Gabriel did not force conversation into the silence. He had learned long ago that people in shock are often treated as though they owe the world coherence on demand. They do not. Feels. Shock makes strange weather in the mind. It floods one memory, erases another, magnifies a sentence, blurs an entire year. Feels. Grace sat with both hands folded around the strap of her bag and stared through the tinted window at Los Angeles, sliding by in shards of white and red. Billboards, homeless encampments under overpasses, luxury condos with mirrored facades. Feels. Taco trucks still serving at 1 in the morning. A couple arguing outside a pharmacy. The city remained itself no matter what private catastrophe unfolded inside one car. Gabriel remembered hating that after his father died. Feels. The way traffic lights still changed. The way coffee still brewed in diners. The way people still laughed on sidewalks while your whole internal structure had collapsed. Feels. There was an insult in ordinary time continuing. When they reached the penthouse, Grace stepped inside and stopped just past the threshold. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the city below like a jeweled map. The place was vast, feels, but not showy in the childish way rich men often decorated their loneliness. Dark wood, stone, good lighting. A space designed by someone who did not like clutter and did not trust softness until it had been tested. Grace stood very still, feels. One of those people who become quieter, not louder, in the presence of excess. Gabriel handed her a glass of water instead of a drink. "There's a guest room on the east side. Clothes will be brought up in the morning," feels. "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." She took the glass with both hands. "Why are you doing this?" He could have answered a dozen ways. Debt, loyalty, protection. He gave her the truest one. "Because your father died saving me," feels. Grace lowered her eyes. "That doesn't explain all of it," feels. No, he thought. It doesn't. It doesn't explain why hearing you cry made something in me feel like a blade turned under the skin. It doesn't explain why the idea of Victor touching your life makes me want to tear down half the city, feels. It doesn't explain why I am suddenly aware of every sharp corner in this apartment, because you look like you've been surviving too long among sharp things. But those truths belong to a later hour, if they belong to any hour at all, feels. It explains enough for tonight, he said. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later with updates, a medic and 2 women from Gabriel's operations team who could manage practical needs without making Grace feel examined. Feels. One checked the building's security and safe room. One took Grace's measurements with brisk dignity and asked whether she had any medication, allergies, or emergency contacts. When Grace answered that she had no one to call, feels. The woman's expression changed only for half a second, but Gabriel saw it. Feels. There was always a moment when other people learned the scale of someone's aloneness. If they had a soul, they softened. If they did not, they calculated. Gabriel knew which category most of his people fell into. Feels. He had selected them that way on purpose after too many years of discovering that competence without decency curdled into monstrosity. Victor's network is smaller than before, Marcus said once Grace had been shown to the guest room. Feels. He spread printouts over the dining table. He's been operating through shell crews. He buys debt. He targets the desperate. Favors, leverage, coercion. The usual rot. Gabriel studied the pages. Were housed. Confirmed. South Industrial Corridor, feels. But I don't like how easy it was to confirm. Trap, probably. Gabriel nodded. Everything about him is a trap. That doesn't mean we wait forever. Marcus glanced toward the guest wing. And the girl. Gabriel lifted his eyes. Feels. Marcus knew him too well to waste time pretending this was routine. Feels. She stays here until it's done, Gabriel said. You sure that's wise? No, that usually means it matters. Gabriel looked back at the papers. It matters. Marcus did not smile, but something close to sympathy moved through his face. Feels. Then let's make sure mattering doesn't get anyone else killed. The next morning, Grace entered the kitchen in a borrowed sweater and paused when she saw Gabriel at the island with black coffee and 6 open files in front of him. Feels. Her hair was still damp from a shower. Without the restaurant uniform, she looked younger and more tired, which was a cruel combination. People always think youth is armor. It is not. Often it is just another thing grief strips from you. Feels. You don't have to stand, Gabriel said when she hesitated in the doorway. I wasn't. Then don't hover either. Sit. She sat. He slid a plate toward her. Eggs, toast, fruit, real breakfast, not a performative one. Feels. Grace looked at it as though she were not used to meals arriving without a cost attached. Thank you. Eat while it's warm. She took a bite because refusing care is exhausting when you are already exhausted. After a few moments, she said, Feels. I looked up your name. Gabriel almost laughed. That must have been encouraging. Depends which part is true. Most of it. None of it. All of it from different angles. That's not an answer. It's the closest thing to one I can offer. Feels. Grace set the fork down. My mother lied to me about my father. My boss was threatening me. Apparently a man I thought was dead may want to use me to hurt you. I woke up in a penthouse owned by someone the internet can't decide is a philanthropist. Feels. Criminal or myth. I think I'm entitled to better answers than riddles. Gabriel studied her for a moment, and because he respected courage when it appeared plainly, he answered plainly. Your father worked in my father's security detail, not legal security. Feels. You know that now. The man who arranged the ambush 8 years ago is alive. His name is Victor Crane. He had reason to hate Thomas. He has reason to hate me more. He placed Derek near you because debt makes people easier to trap. If I say much more, Feels. I put you in danger in ways you don't yet understand. I'm already in danger. Yes, Gabriel said softly. You are. Grace looked away. The truth of it had landed harder than the content. They ate in silence for a minute. Feels. Then she asked the question he had been waiting for. What was he really like? Thomas? She nodded. Gabriel leaned back and let memory come without forcing it. Quiet, the kind of man who did not speak to fill air. He was early to everything. Always. Feels. Once when I was 16, I crashed a sports car into a retaining wall because I thought speed could impress a girl I had no business trying to impress. I was half concussed and bleeding and terrified my father would find out. Feels. Thomas got there before the rest of security. Feels. He looked at the car, looked at me and said, if you wanted attention, there were easier ways. Then he got me stitched up and told my father himself so I wouldn't lie badly. Grace's mouth twitched in spite of herself. That sounds like him. Feels. He brought oranges everywhere. What? In his coat pocket, in the car, in the gym, said processed food made people stupid and weakness starts with what you ignore every day. Feels. Once he made 3 grown men in our operations unit stop a meeting so they could eat fruit. Grace let out a small laugh, surprised by it. Then tears rushed into her eyes so quickly that the laugh broke apart. Gabriel stayed still. Feels. Grief can turn on a dime like that. One harmless detail, one remembered habit, one ordinary human quirk, and suddenly the dead person becomes real again instead of symbolic. That is when the loss deepens. My mom used to buy oranges, Grace said. Feels. Even when we were broke. Feels. She'd say my father was stubborn about food, and if she ever stopped buying them, he'd haunt the kitchen. Gabriel felt something inside his chest loosen and ache at the same time. Then he was consistent. Grace wiped at her face, angry at the tears. Feels. I don't know what to do with all of this. You don't have to do anything with it today. That sounds nice, she said, voice unsteady, but it also sounds like advice rich people give when bills are handled by someone else. Gabriel deserved that. Fair. Feels. I can't just sit here. I have debt, my landlord. The debt will be dealt with. She straightened immediately. No, Gabriel met her gaze. It will. I'm not taking charity. It isn't charity. Then what is it? Feels. He held her eyes until she stopped trying to look away. What your father should have been paid long ago. What my family owed what I owed him. Pick the version that offends you least. Grace opened her mouth, closed it again, then shook her head. Feels. You can't buy your way out of guilt. I know. That answer caught her off guard because she expected defense. Then why? Because a hospital should not have been able to bankrupt your mother for trying to stay alive, Gabriel said. Feels. And the force in his own voice surprised even him. Because men like Derek count on desperate people having no margin. Because your father died in service to a world that paid itself first and the decent people last, Feels. Because some debts are financial and some are moral and they are not the same. Grace looked at him for a long time. You really think money fixes this? No, he said. I think money fixes what money broke. The rest takes longer. Feels. She said nothing after that, but she did not say no again. Over the next 2 days, the penthouse became a strange kind of shelter. Not peaceful exactly. Too many calls. Too many men moving through with updates, weapons checks, route maps, feels, and intelligence packets. But within the danger, an odd routine formed. Feels. Breakfast together because Gabriel insisted people under stress eat at regular hours. Tea at night because Grace could not sleep if she drank coffee after noon. Feels. A stack of books appearing in the guest room after she mentioned she had once planned to finish a degree in social work and still missed reading for pleasure. When she found them, Feels, she stood in the doorway holding one against her chest, as though the gift had touched some older bruise than either of them had named. You remembered, she said that evening. Gabriel shrugged, suddenly feeling absurdly exposed. Feels. You said you liked those authors. Most people don't remember things like that. Most people are inattentive or self-involved. That too. She smiled then. Feels. And the smile changed her face in a way that made the room feel unexpectedly more dangerous for him. Not because she was a threat, because tenderness always was. He had spent years mastering violence, negotiations, supply chains, retaliations, silence. Feels. Tenderness required an entirely different discipline. It asked a man not merely to control destruction, but to refuse it even when his own instincts had been shaped by it. One night Grace found him on the balcony just after midnight. Feels. He had removed his suit jacket and loosened the top button of his shirt. The city spread below them in electric veins. You should be asleep, he said without turning. You say that like it works if someone says it. Sometimes authority is persuasive. Feels. Not this time. She stepped beside him and then her eyes caught on the raised lines visible through the thin shirt across his shoulder and back. Those are from that night, she said quietly. Gabriel nodded. 2 bullets. One grazed. She hesitated. Feels. Then reached out with 2 fingers and lightly touched the fabric over one scar. The contact was so gentle it nearly undid him. No demand, no seduction, no performance. Just human recognition of pain carried too long alone. Feels. He turned and found her looking at him not with fear, but with sorrow. You survived, she whispered, because he made sure I did, and you've been carrying that ever since. Gabriel gave a slight, humorless smile. You make it sound noble, Feels. Maybe not noble, she said, but human. He looked at her more carefully after that. Grace had the strange clarity some suffering people develop, not because pain makes them wise by magic, Feels, but because surviving without illusion forces a kind of moral focus. She did not romanticize what he was. She did not flinch from the fact that his world was violent, Feels. Yet she still managed to distinguish between a man shaped by darkness and a man devoted to it. That distinction mattered more to Gabriel than he wanted it to. The next morning, Marcus spread a satellite image across the office table. Feels. We can hit the warehouse tomorrow night. 20 men, 3 teams, north exit, south exit, front breach. Feels. Gabriel listened, but unease had already begun moving under his skin. The plan was too clean. Victor never gave clean. Victor liked rot, corruption, split loyalties, pressure points hidden in ordinary structures. What's wrong? Marcus asked at last. Feels. Gabriel shook his head once. I don't know yet. I hate when you say that. So do I. Grace spent the afternoon in the library corner with one of the books Gabriel had bought. At one point, she fell asleep with it open on her lap. Feels. Sunlight from the western windows touching her face. Gabriel stood in the doorway longer than he should have, thinking how unfair it was that someone could look safe without ever having been safe. Late that night, he walked her through the safe room again. Feels. Reinforced door, independent ventilation, camera feed, backup phone, medical kit, water. If anything happens, he said, you lock this door and you stay inside until Marcus or I come for you, no matter what you hear. Grace leaned against the frame. Feels. That sounds like something a person says right before something happens. Gabriel's mouth thinned. Then hear me carefully. I am, no matter what you hear. She searched his face, found no exaggeration there, and nodded. Okay, he should have left then, Eels. Instead, he stood there, both of them caught in the strange awareness that disaster often sharpens. You don't have to protect me because of obligation, Grace said softly. I know, Eels. Then why does it feel like you're standing at the edge of something every time you look at me? Gabriel could have lied. He was good at lying when necessary. Because, he said after a moment, Eels, I have spent years believing that loyalty only leads to blood, and then you walked into my life carrying the memory of the man who proved the opposite. Grace looked down, then back up. That's not all. No, he thought again. It isn't, Eels. But before either of them could do anything reckless with the silence between them, his phone lit up with Marcus's number. Eels. Boss, we've got movement on the east approach. Gabriel's whole body tightened. How many? Not sure yet. Cameras just cut on level 41. Gabriel moved instantly. Get her in the safe room. The building lights died before he reached the main hall. Darkness slammed through the penthouse. Then the gunfire started. Eels. The first thing Grace understood was the sound. Not because she had heard an assault like this before, but because the body knows the difference between noise and violence. Violence has intention inside it. Eels. The lights had barely gone when shots cracked from the hallway, sharp and close, followed by glass exploding somewhere to the right, and a man shouting something she could not make out. Gabriel's hand closed around her upper arm, firm but not hurting, Eels, and guided her forward fast. Safe room, now. He pushed the backup phone into her hand. Lock it. Do not come out. No matter what you hear. Then he was gone, Eels, already moving toward the gunfire with Marcus and two guards converging from the stairwell. Grace ran because fear finally made the choice for her. Inside the safe room, she slammed the reinforced door shut and turned the lock with shaking hands. Eels. Her breath came too fast. She forced herself toward the wall monitor and activated the security feed. Static, then image. Eels. The living area appeared in grayscale first, then color as auxiliary power caught. Men in dark tactical clothing moved through the hall. One of Gabriel's guards dropped near the piano. Eels. Another fired from behind the kitchen island before going down in a spray of red that looked almost black on the screen. Marcus was at the corridor junction, shoulder tucked to the wall, returning fire with brutal efficiency. Eels. Gabriel moved differently from everyone else. Not faster exactly. More certain. The difference between a man shooting to survive and a man who has lived long enough with violence that it has become another language. He dropped one intruder, pivoted, Eels, disarmed another, and then vanished from frame as the camera feed jittered. Grace pressed both hands to her mouth. Her mind did the awful thing minds do under pressure. It split. One part observed details with inhuman sharpness. The smashed vase, Eels, the smoke drifting low, the strange way one body's shoe had come off. Eels. Another part was still back in the restaurant hallway, still hearing Gabriel say your father died a brave man, still feeling the earth shift under the story of her own life. Then a third part, small but growing, began to understand something much worse. Eels. This was not random. This was personal. One of the hallway cameras flashed and died. Another angle came up from the living room. Gabriel was on the floor. Two men had him down, one knee across his arm, another forcing his hands behind his back. Eels. Marcus had been hit. He was still conscious, dragging himself toward cover, blood darkening his shirt at the shoulder. Then a man stepped into frame, and the room itself seemed to contract around him. Victor Crane, Eels. Grace knew it before the audio fed through and gave his name shape inside the air. He had a long, controlled face and eyes so black they looked less like features than openings cut into the human mask. He held a pistol with total ease, not a flourish. Eels, ease. Eels. The kind that comes from using a tool often enough that it becomes an extension of the will. Gabriel Mercer, he said, and even through the speaker his voice carried a soft cruelty that made Grace's skin go cold. 8 years is a long time to wait. Eels. Gabriel's face was bloodied but composed. I should have made sure you were Ash. Victor smiled. You should have been sure of many things. He walked a slow circle around Gabriel as if savoring an old story finally returning to its final chapter. Eels. Your father died quickly. Thomas Sullivan ruined that by making sure you didn't. Grace felt the room tilt. Her father, not as memory, not as ache, as leverage in a conversation between monsters. Eels. Victor crouched and angled the gun toward Gabriel's forehead. Do you know what hate becomes when you feed it correctly? Patience. Eels. I learned patience while you built restaurants and gave interviews, and pretended legitimacy could wash blood from a family line. Eels. Gabriel strained against the men holding him. If you want me, then take me. But that would teach you nothing. Victor's voice softened, which made it worse. Men like you only learn through helplessness. Feels. Grace's eyes flicked to the lower left corner of the feed where the camera captured part of the guest corridor. Empty. No one moving toward the safe room yet. Her breathing grew shallow. She knew what Gabriel had told her. Stay inside. Feels. No matter what you hear. Rationally, she understood why. Emotionally, the monitor was doing something unbearable. It was turning human beings into evidence while she stood untouched behind steel. The audio hissed again. Victor said, Feels. Thomas Sullivan saved you once. Tonight no one will. Then, after the smallest pause, the sentence that changed everything. My men are finding his daughter as we speak. Grace went rigid. Feels. For one terrible instant, she imagined they already knew where she was and that the handle would start turning any second. Feels. But nothing moved. No shadow under the door, no boots in the hall. Maybe the building's internal layout still protected her. Maybe Gabriel's people had held longer than Victor expected. Maybe she had minutes, maybe less. Feels. She backed toward the cabinet and remembered what Gabriel had shown her. Shelf-locked box, key in the medical kit. Her fingers worked with the open. Handgun. Heavier than she expected. Cold. Unforgiving. Grace had never fired a weapon. Feels. She had never even touched one. Her mother had distrusted even kitchen knives left out on counters after bad news segments on television. This thing in her hand was not symbolic. It did not care whether she was moral or frightened or good. Feels. It would make a hole in flesh if her finger closed and the muzzle aligned with a human body. She looked back at the monitor. Gabriel's face had turned toward the camera angle now, though he could not see her. There was blood at his temple. Feels. Victor said something else, but Grace barely heard it because another memory rose from somewhere deeper than thought. Her mother at the sink, paying bills with shaking hands. Feels. The night the electricity almost went out because the hospital wanted another payment plan. Derek's voice in the hallway saying girls like you have no choices. Ryan offering sympathy but not safety because poor men are often terrified too. Feels. The system that had swallowed her mother. The boss who preyed on debt. The lie about her father's death. All of it joined suddenly into one hard line inside her. This is how cruelty survives, she thought. Not only through the people who commit it. Feels. Through the people it trains to stay hidden while decent men die in front of them. The thought frightened her because it was not fully fair. Survival is not cowardice. Hiding from armed killers is not moral failure. Feels. But the truth was more personal than that. Feels. If Gabriel died while she watched from behind reinforced steel, she would understand intellectually why she had stayed. She would still carry the image like poison for the rest of her life. Feels. She would hear her father's unfinished sentence in every quiet room she ever entered again. My daughter, Grace, please, please. What, Liv? Hide, be brave, be careful, protect yourself. Protect someone. The dead never finish speaking. Feels. The living finish for them, and sometimes we choose the ending that lets us keep breathing. Grace checked the handgun the way she had seen once in a self-defense class years earlier. Magazine seated. Safety. She barely knew what she was doing. Feels. Her hands trembled anyway. You don't have to be fearless. Her mother used to say on the rare days she was strong enough to give advice. You just have to decide what you refuse to let fear turn you into. Grace unlocked the safe room. Feels. The hallway outside was dark except for emergency strip lights near the floor. Feels. Smoke drifted from the living area. She moved one step at a time, each one impossibly loud in her own head. Victor, amused. Gabriel, hoarse with restraint. Someone groaning in pain. Feels. She reached the edge of the corridor and saw the scene directly now, not through filtered glass. Bodies, blood, broken furniture, Marcus on one knee with one arm useless. Gabriel forced down, hands bound. Feels. Victor turning slightly at the sound of something one of his men said. Grace raised the gun with both hands the way movies had taught half the world to imitate a skill they did not possess. Stop, she shouted. Every face turned. Feels. For a fraction of a second the room held still. Gabriel's expression changed first. Horror, not for himself, for her. Grace, no! Victor looked delighted. Thomas Sullivan's daughter, he said, as if being presented with a gift. Feels. I was about to come fetch you. The gun shook in Grace's grip. Let him go, Victor laughed. Feels. And you'll make me. The room tightened around the next heartbeat. Grace did not think. She fired. The recoil jolted up her arm like a punch. The bullet missed Victor and slammed into the shoulder of the man beside him, who screamed and went down. Feels. Chaos detonated. Victor swung his own gun toward Grace with terrifying speed. Gabriel roared her name. The muzzle flash was bright enough to erase detail for a beat. Then pain hit, deep, hard. Not the slicing pain she expected, feels, but a savage, blunt impact that turned her knees to water. She looked down and saw blood opening across her abdomen. Strange, she thought. So much blood for one body. Then the floor rose toward her. She heard voices through cotton. Marcus firing, heels. Men shouting. Gabriel breaking free with animal force. The gun slid out of her hand. On her back now, staring upward at the ceiling, Grace had the oddest thought of all. So this is why people sound far away when they are close to death. It isn't the ears, heels. It's the mind pulling backward. Victor and Gabriel crashed into each other in the edge of her vision. No guns now. Fists, pure hatred with nowhere left to hide. She could not focus on the fight. Instead, memory braided with the present in flashes. Heels. Her father lifting her onto his shoulders at a county fair. Her mother asleep in a hospital chair. Ryan quietly slipping her a sandwich after a double shift. Gabriel setting books in her room because he had remembered. The balcony. The scars. Heels. The care in a man built for hard things. She wanted to say something, ask something. Her mouth moved. Did I do the right thing? She thought she asked, though she was not sure whether sound came out. The next thing she knew, Gabriel was above her, heels, his hand pressing hard against the wound, face wrecked by something she had never seen in him before. Not anger. Fear, fear, fear. Stay with me, he said, voice breaking around the words. Grace, stay with me. She tried to focus on him. Heels. It mattered suddenly that she see him clearly. Are you okay? She whispered, because that was still the question that had driven her from the safe room in the first place. Gabriel laughed once in disbelief and pain. I'm fine, heels. It was a lie and both of them knew it. You're going to be fine. Behind him, Marcus was on the phone shouting for an ambulance. Somewhere to the left, Victor lay restrained, not dead. A guard was kicking a weapon away, heels. Someone was crying out for medical supplies. The room had not stopped being a battlefield, but Gabriel's entire world had narrowed to the blood spilling between his fingers. My father, Grace managed. The effort cost more than she expected, heels. Would he? She could not finish. Gabriel bent closer until his forehead almost touched hers. He would be proud, he said. Do you hear me? He would be proud. But you have to live proud. The word entered her and went somewhere very deep. Heels. She had spent years believing survival was the only available ambition. Now bleeding on a floor she had never imagined standing on, she understood something sharper. Dignity is not the opposite of fear, heels. It is what remains when fear no longer gets the final vote. The sirens grew louder. Gabriel kept talking to her, not because words could close a wound, but because the human voice can tether the mind to the body when pain tries to separate them. Heels. Stay with me. Look at me breathe. That's it. Again, she did once, twice. Then the lights above her blurred and folded into darkness. She woke in pieces after that. A stretcher jostling under her, white ceiling panels streaking overhead. Heels. A paramedic cutting fabric away. Someone calling out blood pressure numbers. Gabriel's hand leaving hers only when the emergency room doors split them apart. Then anesthesia. Then nothing at all. Heels. Gabriel had known waiting rooms before. Police precinct hallways. Funeral parlors. Courthouse back corridors. Private clinics where rich men with bullet wounds pretended they had fallen on kitchen knives. Heels. But no room he had ever entered was as punishing as the surgical waiting area outside Recovery Wing 4 that night. Maybe because for once there was no action left to take. No strategy to improve the odds. No threat to neutralize. Heels. Violence creates the illusion that force can solve what force has broken. Hospitals strip that illusion away. They reduce power to a chair, a closed door, a clock moving too slowly. Heels. And a body you cannot follow past a certain point, no matter how many men obey your orders outside. Gabriel sat with Grace's blood dried across his hands and cuffs, and did not bother cleaning it off. Let people stare. Let them whisper. Heels. It meant nothing beside the image replaying under his eyelids every time he blinked. Grace stepping out of the hallway with a gun she barely knew how to hold, because hiding safely would have cost her more than bleeding openly. Heels. Marcus arrived from triage with his shoulder stitched and his face gray from blood loss and painkillers. Victor's secure, he said. Gabriel looked up. Alive, unfortunately for him. Good, heels. Marcus sat 2 chairs away and stretched his injured arm carefully across his lap. Derrick's handled. Buildings locked down. Internal investigation already started on the power cut. We had a leak in facilities. Not high level. Bought with debt. Heels. Same pattern as before. Gabriel nodded once. The elegant cruelty of making poverty do the dirty work. A maintenance worker with a sick child, a subcontractor behind on rent, a cousin in rehab. It was always some version of that. Feels. Men like Victor built empires not only on greed, but on the parts of the system already designed to crush the weak. Offer money to the desperate. Offer forgiveness to the ashamed. Offer silence to the compromised. Feels. Then watch respectable institutions become delivery systems for predation. You should get checked again, Marcus said. Gabriel's knuckles were split. A cut above his eye had swollen nearly shut. His ribs hurt when he breathed. I'm fine. Feels. Marcus let that go because friendship among men like them was often expressed as selective surrender to useless arguments. An hour passed. Then another. Nurses moved in and out. Families drifted by in clumps of fear. Feels. A little boy slept across 3 chairs while his grandmother prayed into clasped hands. 2 women argued softly over insurance paperwork. A man in work boots, paste, and paste. Hospitals level people in strange ways. Feels. Money buys better rooms, better specialists, shorter waits sometimes, but not the ability to love less, or fear less, or bargain more effectively with a body trying to leave. Gabriel watched all of it and thought of Grace's mother, Linda Sullivan. Feels. 10 months of cancer, $127,000. He found that number circling him now like a curse. It was obscene, not only because it was large, Feels, but because it represented the cumulative violence respectable systems commit while wearing legal language. Billing, denial, out-of-network, late fees, survival turned into invoice. Feels. People like Victor and Derek were easy to hate because they looked like villains if you stared at them long enough. But cruelty that passes through institutions is often more devastating because it asks to be called policy. Feels. Gabriel had built legitimate businesses to launder power, yes, but also because even in the underworld he had come to despise the way weak people were treated as expendable inputs. Feels. He did not fool himself into sainthood. He had blood on his hands older than some marriages. But there are moments when a man sees his own life reflected in the ugliness around him and decides one part of the cycle ends here. Around hour 3, Feels. Marcus said quietly, "You care about her." Gabriel did not look at him. That's an observation, not a question. It can be both, and the answer is yes. Marcus leaned back. Because of Thomas. Not only because of Thomas. Feels. Saying it aloud made the truth impossible to retreat from. That's more dangerous, I know, for her too. Gabriel turned then. You think I don't know that? Marcus held his gaze. I think you know it very well. Feels. Which is why you need to decide whether protecting her means keeping her close or making sure she can live far away from everything you are. Gabriel wanted to snap back something easy and hard. Feels. Instead, he sat with the question because Marcus had earned that right long ago. Feels. To love someone from inside a violent structure is to ask whether your presence is shelter or contamination. Men like Gabriel often lie to themselves and call possession protection. He had seen it too many times. Feels. Watched bosses build cages lined with velvet and convince themselves they were saving the woman inside. If Grace lived, he would not become another version of that lie. The surgeon came out just after dawn. Fatigue lived in the man's posture, Feels, but not defeat. Gabriel was on his feet before the doctor fully cleared the doorway. How is she? The surgeon removed his cap. The bullet missed the liver by a small margin. She lost a lot of blood. There was internal damage, but we controlled it. Feels. She's young, strong. The next 24 hours matter, but she made it through surgery. Gabriel felt the floor come back beneath him. Not relief exactly. Relief is too clean. This was more like a chokehold loosening one finger at a time. Feels. Can I see her? Briefly, once recovery finishes initial checks. Gabriel nodded because words were suddenly unreliable. When he entered the recovery room 40 minutes later, Grace looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. Monitors, IV lines, Feels. Oxygen tubing, skin pale enough to show the bruising underneath. He had seen bodies in far worse shape. That did not help. Damage on strangers is arithmetic. Damage on someone who matters is revelation. He pulled a chair close and sat. Feels. Her hand lay on top of the blanket, palm turned slightly upward, and he took it carefully, as if even sleep might bruise her further. I'm here, he said, though she could not hear him yet. I'm not going anywhere. He stayed. Through the day, Feels. Through the night, into the second day, Marcus brought updates and food Gabriel ignored until threatened. Jake came once, awkward in street clothes, left a bag of clean clothing, and muttered that Ryan kept asking whether Grace was alive. Feels. Gabriel told Marcus to make sure Ryan got some money and time off. and that the story given to staff emphasized a security breach, not gang warfare. Grace deserved privacy where privacy was still possible. By the morning of the third day, Gabriel looked like a man dragged backward through his own life. Stubble, hollow eyes, wrinkled shirt replaced twice worn as if unchanged. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees when Grace finally stirred. First a shift in breathing, then a faint furrow in her brow. Then her eyes opened slowly to the white ceiling. She turned her head and saw him. For a second neither moved. Then she rasped, "You look terrible." The laugh that burst out of Gabriel shocked both of them. Relief sounded almost ugly coming through exhaustion. "You're awake," he said. "You're awake." Grace blinked against the light, then memory entered in fragments. Victor handled Marcus, alive. She shut her eyes briefly and let that settle. When she opened them again, there was only one question in them. "My father," she whispered. "Would he be proud?" Gabriel took a slow breath because this was the question beneath all the others. Not whether the pain was worth it. Not whether the risk made sense. Whether courage offered at terrible cost still meant something in a world full of men who exploit it. "He would hate that you scared me half to death," Gabriel said, voice rough with held emotion. He would say you were reckless. He would say stepping into gunfire was a terrible plan. A weak smile touched her mouth. "That sounds right." And then, Gabriel continued, gripping her hand more firmly. "He would be proud beyond words, because you saw someone in danger and refused to let fear decide who you were. That was your father's best quality. It's yours too." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes. "I thought maybe I was stupid. Those two things are not the same. Sometimes they look alike. Not this time. She was quiet a long moment. Then, with visible effort, she asked, "Why did you stay?" Gabriel looked at her bruised face, at the monitor tracing proof that she remained in the world, and answered with the honesty she had somehow made feel necessary. "Because if you died, something in me I have no right to lose would have gone with you." Grace did not answer immediately. Her fingers shifted inside his. "That's a frightening sentence." "I know." "You always know when something is frightening and say it anyway?" "Usually. That explains a lot." Her strength faded after that, and the nurse gently intervened, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Not simplified, not solved, changed. There are moments when two people stop standing on opposite sides of their own pain and begin, however uncertainly, to look in the same direction. Recovery was slow in the honest way real recovery often is. No cinematic leap from deathbed to laughter. Grace hurt. She slept badly. She needed help standing the first time and cried from humiliation when the effort left her dizzy and shaking. Gabriel did not pretend dignity requires independence. He steadied her without making her feel observed. Sat with her through medication fog. Read aloud from one of the books he had bought when her concentration failed after a page. The nurses started smiling when they entered, because the feared man by the bed turned out to be the patient's most cooperative caretaker. He learned the medication schedule. He adjusted pillows with absurd precision. He argued with billing staff on the phone until a vice president appeared in person. When Grace found out he had done that, she stared at him. "You bullied the hospital administrator. I requested correction." With what looked in your eyes like murder, Gabriel did not deny it. "No one gets to turn your survival into administrative confusion." Grace watched him carefully. "This matters to you beyond me, doesn't it?" He leaned back in the chair. "My mother died in a private clinic that delayed treatment until financial guarantees were signed. She was already dying. The delay probably changed nothing. But my father never forgot the look on her face when someone asked for proof of coverage while she was vomiting blood." Grace absorbed that in silence. It was the first thing personal Gabriel had offered that was not directly connected to Thomas. A doorway, small and unexpected. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." It was a long time ago. That doesn't mean it stopped mattering. He looked at her then with something like startled respect. No, it didn't. The closer she came to strength, the more practical questions arrived. Police statements, carefully managed. A cover story about a targeted home invasion tied it to an ongoing organized crime investigation. Marcus arranging for a new apartment lease under layers of protection. Grace reading discharge paperwork like someone who had learned the hard way that forms can hide violence too. One afternoon, with late sun turning the room gold, Gabriel laid an envelope on her blanket. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside were documents. Bank letters, Hospital debt cleared, interest settled, outstanding rent advanced for 6 months, a tuition account restored in her name at the university she had left. Grace looked up sharply. No, yes, heels. Gabriel, it is not a gift, it is not leverage. It is what should have existed long before now, a loyalty fund, if you need a label. You can't just rewrite my life with a signature. No, he said, heels. But I can remove weights that were never morally yours to carry alone. Grace set the papers aside and met his gaze with unusual steadiness. If I take this, I need you to understand something. Say it. I am not becoming your project. Heels. I am not a damaged thing you rescued. I am not your penance. Heels. Gabriel felt respect rise, almost like relief. Agreed. And I'm not staying near you because I'm grateful. Then don't. I'm staying, she said softly, because somewhere in all of this I stopped feeling alone. Heels. That struck harder than any confession of romantic feeling could have. Loneliness had shaped them both in different languages. For Grace, it had been bills, illness, shifts, silence, heels, the daily humiliation of needing too much from a world that offered too little. For Gabriel, it had been command, suspicion, blood inheritance, the endless isolation of being useful to many and known by almost none. Then don't be alone, he said, heels, equally quiet. Not anymore. She reached out for his hand. No spectacle, no promise dressed as poetry, just contact, skin to skin, choice without coercion, human closeness after too many years of learning distance as defense. Heels. Outside the window, traffic moved in obedient lines below the hospital tower, life continuing again. Heels. This time it did not feel like insult. It felt unexpectedly like invitation. Heels. 3 months later, Grace stood on the balcony of Gabriel's penthouse, with one hand wrapped around a glass of mineral water and the other resting lightly against the healed scar beneath her shirt. The city looked different from up here, heels, though maybe it was she who had changed. The scar no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like punctuation, heels. A hard mark dividing the woman who had endured because she had no choice from the woman who had begun choosing what kind of life she would build. Recovery had been uneven in the way real recovery always is, heels. There were strong mornings and frightened nights. There were days when the elevator's hum reminded her of the hospital and made her palms sweat. Days when sudden male voices in hallways sent adrenaline skidding through her ribs before reason caught up. Heels. Gabriel had arranged for a trauma therapist with no ties to his world, no financial pressure to please him, and enough spine to tell him to leave the room when Grace needed privacy. Heels. That choice mattered. Love, Grace was learning, was not proven only by how fiercely someone protected you. It was proven by whether they respected your personhood while doing it. By whether they made room for your voice, your boundaries, heels, your future independent of their desire. Gabriel did not always get it right. He had controlling instincts forged in dangerous places. Sometimes he defaulted to command when care would have done, heels. Sometimes his silence still turned the air into something hard to cross. But when she pushed back, he listened, not immediately every time, not gracefully every time. Still he listened, and then he changed what he could, heels. That might have been the most radical thing about him. Not that he was powerful. Plenty of powerful men exist. It was that, in private where domination would have been easiest, he chose restraint. Grace had moved back to school 2 weeks earlier, heels. Not because Gabriel wanted a symbol of redemption, heels. Because she had spent too many years postponing a life that belonged to her. Her first day back on campus had nearly undone her. Students hurrying with coffee cups, flyers for clubs. A professor she remembered only vaguely, heels, the ordinary noise of possibility. She had sat in her car and cried before walking into the building because grief sometimes returns disguised as gratitude. Her mother should have seen this. Her father, too. Gabriel had not tried to come with her, heels. He had asked once what she needed and accepted the answer when she said, "I need to do the first day on my own." At noon, she found a message from him anyway. No grand speech. Just, "Proud of you. Eat lunch." Heels. She had laughed in the middle of campus at the second sentence because it sounded exactly like something her father might have said. And because Gabriel still believed food was a moral category. Heels. Marcus had recovered enough to resume work with his usual dry precision. Jake still checked in occasionally. Heels. Ryan now promoted and enrolled in night classes with discreet financial help that Gabriel pretended not to know about. Sent Grace awkward texts that mostly said things like, "Hope we're okay," and "I quit if anyone ever says team culture to me again." Heels. Derek was gone, and the restaurant staff had been given raises, grievance protections, and a third-party reporting channel Gabriel forced the company lawyers to implement whether they liked it or not. Feels. If you build a place where fear gets managed privately, Grace had told him one night over dinner, you're just giving predators better wallpaper. Gabriel had looked at her for a long moment and then called an executive meeting the next morning. Feels. That was another thing changing. He no longer kept his worlds as cleanly separated as before. He had spent years pretending legitimate businesses were simply fronts, useful structures for money and information. Grace challenged that without speeches. Feels, just by existing. Feels. By pointing out that every payroll decision, every healthcare benefit, every scheduling rule, every manager retained or dismissed altered the moral texture of hundreds of ordinary lives. Not all violence uses weapons. Feels. She said once while reviewing a draft employee policy with him on the living room floor. Some of it uses exhaustion, or humiliation, or uncertainty. Gabriel had looked at the document, then at her, and replied, Feels. You should have gone into organizational reform, not social work. Grace smiled at the memory now and looked east where the horizon was beginning to thin with early morning light. Behind her, the balcony door slid open. Gabriel stepped out, jacket off, heels, tie loose, the end of a long day still on him. He handed her a glass of wine out of habit before remembering and switching it for tea. You're getting predictable, she said. That sounds like criticism. It's actually comforting. Feels. He came to stand beside her. For a while they said nothing. Feels. The kind of silence that no longer needed to prove safety because it had become one form of it. 3 months earlier, she would have filled the quiet with explanation. He would have retreated into it as cover. Now it simply existed between them. Feels. Warm and unforced. Marcus told me Victor spoke again, Grace said at last. Gabriel's expression hardened fractionally. Victor Crane had not been killed. That had been Gabriel's decision. Death would have closed the story too neatly. Feels. Instead, Victor had been transferred into federal custody through channels so complex and incriminating that he would likely spend the rest of his life negotiating with prosecutors who had no intention of letting him bargain his way into daylight. Feels. Names, accounts, trafficking ties, extortion routes, debt purchase schemes. The investigation had begun pulling more than one rotten structure into the light. He talks a lot, Gabriel said. That's what trapped him. Feels. Do you regret not killing him? Gabriel considered before answering, which was part of what Grace loved most about him now. He did not perform virtue for her. He wrestled toward it. Every violent instinct I have still says yes, he admitted. But no, Feels. I think too many men in my life solved pain by ending the person in front of them. It teaches nothing. It repairs nothing. Sometimes the more difficult thing is letting consequences outlive rage. Grace nodded. My therapist would like that answer. Feels. I dislike your therapist on principle. Because she sees through you? Because she charges by the hour to tell me I have control issues. You do, so I'm told. Grace smiled and turned toward him more fully. The city lights reflected in his eyes. Feels. She had once thought those eyes were only made for hard things. Now she knew hardness was simply what he had needed most often. Feels. Underneath it lived attentiveness, loyalty, an almost painful capacity for devotion, and a moral hunger he had hidden under cynicism because hope had cost too much in the circles where he learned manhood. What happens now? She asked. Feels. Gabriel gave the same answer he had given months earlier, but this time it carried less uncertainty and more trust. What do you want to happen? Feels. Grace thought carefully, because wanting is serious when you have spent years reducing yourself to what is survivable. I want to finish school. Feels. I want to work with families drowning in medical debt and grief bureaucracy, and all the things no one explains when they're already falling apart. I want to make something useful out of what happened, without making my whole life about what happened. Feels. Gabriel listened the way he always did when it mattered, completely. And us, he asked. Grace looked at him, the most feared man in half the city, asking a question he could have forced into certainty and choosing not to. Feels. That mattered too. She said slowly. Depends on whether you understand that loving me doesn't mean owning where I stand. Gabriel stepped closer, not touching yet. I understand that better now than I used to. Maybe not perfectly, Feels, but enough to keep learning. And enough not to build me a beautiful cage. If I ever do, he said, I expect you to burn it down. Good. She set the tea on the railing and finally took his hand. Then I want to try. Feels. The relief that moved across his face was brief and unguarded and so human it almost hurt to witness. Then we try, he said. No dramatic kiss followed, no swelling music. Real life rarely arranges itself that neatly, feels, especially for people carrying as much history as they did. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder and watched dawn begin over Los Angeles, a city full of private damage and private mercy, feels, of systems that failed and people who still chose one another anyway, feels. Grace thought then of the sentence her story had been moving toward from the moment Gabriel first heard her crying in the break room. Not a fairy tale, not salvation through wealth or violence or romance alone. Something harder and truer, feels. That respect is a form of love. That protection without respect becomes control. That gratitude is hollow if it does not become action. That no one should be humiliated for being poor, sick, frightened, or in need, feels. That institutions can wound people as deeply as criminals do, and therefore changing a policy can sometimes save a life as surely as stopping a bullet. That surviving does not disqualify you from tenderness, feels. That healing is not forgetting what happened, but building a life in which what happened is no longer the only thing that speaks when you enter a room. She thought of Thomas Sullivan with his oranges and his stubborn decency, feels, of Linda paying bills at the sink with shaking hands, feels, of Ryan and Jake and Marcus and the nameless nurse who had adjusted Grace's blanket at 4 a.m. as though she mattered, of Gabriel, who had been shaped by brutality and had still chosen, again and again, feels, not to let brutality define the final use of his power. You know, Grace said as the first line of sun touched the edge of the skyline, for a long time I thought my life was just one bad thing after another, feels. Like all I could do was endure whatever came next. Gabriel looked at her. And now? Now I think endurance is only the first chapter, she said. What comes after matters just as much, what you build, who you become, what you refuse to pass on, feels. Gabriel's hand tightened gently around hers. That, he said, sounds like your father talking. Maybe, Grace answered. Or maybe it sounds like me. The sun rose a little higher. Feels. Somewhere below them, the city began another day of traffic, rent, meetings, hustling, grief, laughter, coffee, sirens, school runs, payroll, arguments, apologies, and second chances. Nothing was magically clean, feels. Gabriel still had a dangerous world to untangle. Grace still had nights when pain visited her body without warning. They still had to learn what love looked like between two people who knew too much about loss, feels. But the darkness no longer had exclusive claim on either of them, and in the end, that was the real victory. Not that a villain fell, not that a debt was paid, but that two human beings stepped out of the machinery of fear and chose, feels, with full knowledge of how fragile life is, to treat each other with dignity, honesty, and care. Sometimes that choice is more radical than revenge, feels. Sometimes it is the only thing that keeps the worst parts of the world from reproducing themselves forever.